Good afternoon and welcome to the annual Lee Jackson Day Symposium here in Lexington, Virginia. We're coming to you from the Virginia Horse Center this year, and I want to welcome each of our guests. We've had several tours this morning. I'm sure a lot of you were on those. I hope you enjoyed those and that they all went well. And it's good to see a good crowd here this morning. It's always good when we have to add extra seating. Our first speaker at the symposium today will be Robert E.L. Crick, known as Bobby. I met him many years ago, back in the early 2000s. When I was working with Bragg Bowling and in the Virginia division at a lot of events, we always discuss the Cricks, and it's good to have him here. I want to thank our associate member, Skip Schaefer, for helping to sponsor him and make that possible today. Robert E.L. Bobby Crick has lived or worked on the Civil War battlefields almost continuously since 1972. He grew up on the Chancellorsville battlefield in Fredericksburg and graduated from Mary Washington College in Fredericksburg as well with a degree in history. He has worked in various historical capacities at several battlefields, including Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument in Montana and Manassas National Battlefield Park. In 1991, he became a historian at Richmond National Battlefield Park. Crick is widely published on Civil War topics. His first book was the 40th Virginia Infantry, which was a unit history, following in 2003 with the University of North Carolina Press, published his staff officers and grade, the biographical register of the Army of Northern Virginia staff officers. He's had many acclaims. No doubt, if you studied Civil War history for very long, you've heard his name, and I want to welcome him this morning to our podium here. It's
fundamental first step is to lay out my watch and make sure that I don't talk too long. Well, my assignment today, you all have a clue as to what it is. It's kind of different, interesting, unique. I'm not talking about Lee, and I'm only half talking about Jackson here on Lee Jackson Day, or close to Lee Jackson Day. My job is to explore the fascinating, somewhat peculiar, surprising relationship, sometimes awkward relationship, between these two men, Stonewall Jackson on the right and the bushy-bearded Cavalier J.E.B. Stuart on the left. Started as a military partnership in 1861. It only lasted for 2 years before Jackson died in the spring of 1863. It developed with almost blinding speed into a peculiar but very real friendship between two generals who, on the face of it, were extremely dissimilar. However you wanted to make a list, gauge the most, the top generals in the Army of Northern Virginia. Say you were taking out your napkin there and a pencil and making a list of the Army of Northern Virginia's greatest leaders. No matter what measuring stick you used, whether it was fame, personality, ability, popularity with the general public, no matter what metrics you used, these two men would be in the top 5 in the history of the Army of Northern Virginia, possibly in the whole history of the Southern Confederacy. 2 of the 5 most famous generals on the south side during the Civil War. Not just because they were senior officers in responsible roles, but because of who they were. Nobody, as far as I know at least, nobody names their children after Braxton Bragg or Joe Johnston or even James Longstreet or A.P. Hill or Jubal Early. There might be a few outliers, but people still name their children after Stonewall Jackson. People still name their children after J.E.B. Stuart, and probably always will until it becomes illegal to. So the peculiar bond between these two men at the very pinnacle of their lives, the zenith, is that much more interesting because of who they were. They're not just two guys, they're two big guys. Now, many of you, I'm sure, know a good bit about both of them, and if you think about the shape of this talk, it'd be easy for you to recognize how simple it is to emphasize their differences. If you know anything about Jeb Stuart, you know how different he was than Stonewall Jackson. And it's a pretty easy task. It's low-hanging fruit, as the phrase is in the 21st century. There's so much material to emphasize their differences. I think I'm obliged to at least review it with you, some of the more important ones. But to me, the similarities between the two men are much more interesting. They get much less attention. We certainly will spend a bunch of time talking about that in just a few minutes, the similarities. But we'll start with the differences. And of course, the chief difference between them was in public behavior and deportment. Jackson, of course, was quiet, single-minded, inflexible, oftentimes for the better, but sometimes for the worse. Not known for his hilarity, very religious, very focused, very single-minded. And then there was Jeb Stuart, who sang everywhere he went, wrote bad poetry for women he barely knew, flirted with every woman he met, attractive or otherwise, loved listening to banjo music. His whole lifestyle, my father invented a term for it. He called it banjoism. As a description of Jeb Stuart's daily life, was indulging in banjoism, the exact polar opposite of Stonewall Jackson. Now here's a classic description of Stuart that was only discovered a few years ago. I didn't discover it, somebody else did, but it's so good I use it whenever I can. It's written in 1865, right at the end of the war, by a general who served under Jeb Stuart. He said there were few men produced by the war whose character was so mixed with gold and dross as Stuart. His endurance was superhuman. Such a mass of animal life I never saw. He could not rest near the enemy, nor permit them to rest, and so on. And yet, mingled with these noble gifts, Stuart was frivolous to the verge of ridicule, almost childish at times. His conversations gave no indication of capacity. On the contrary, one always left him with a painful doubt as to his ability. I think, however, much of the frivolity resulted from his exuberant health. He was like a frat boy. In camp, in the winter, he routinely wrestled in the mud with his staff officers. He tickled his staff officers and danced around the camp like a frat boy. Can you picture Stonewall Jackson doing any of those things? Or even watching anyone do those things? Certainly not. Stuart got along with his superiors and his peers very well. Stuart was a Robert E. Lee protege. He was great chums with Joe Johnston. He was very close with John Letcher, the governor of Virginia from here in Lexington, and others. Jackson rarely got along with anyone. Had a feud with Jefferson Davis. Was cordial and friendly, of course, with Robert E. Lee, but that was about the extent of it. They were very dissimilar even in that. Read you here the oft-quoted A.P. Hill diatribe against Stonewall Jackson. Most of you have heard it before. There's a reason for reading it here. It doesn't have anything to do with the friendship of these two men, but it is kind of tangentially affected. This is A.P. Hill writing in November of 1862. He said, "I suppose I am to vegetate here all the winter under that crazy old Presbyterian fool. The Almighty will get tired of helping Jackson after a while, and then he'll get the damnedest thrashing. And the shoe pinches, for I shall get my share, and probably all the blame, for the people will never blame Stonewall for any disaster." That's A.P. Hill. What makes that interesting is that the recipient of that letter from A.P. Hill was Jeb Stuart. And this was November of 1862, right as their friendship was reaching its full fruit, where Stuart and Jackson were best buddies. And here is A.P. Hill saying some things he probably shouldn't have said to one of Stonewall Jackson's best friends. Another obvious difference, and one where Jackson comes out much the better, is that Jackson was quiet and humble, and Stuart was not. Stuart allowed vanity and public relations to consume way too much of his time. He was never able to suppress the unseemly fires of ambition which roared through his body. Stuart was extremely concerned about his rank, his position, his reputation, what people thought of him. Jackson had almost none of those things. Jackson was a little protective of his rank, and that was about the extent of it. Another difference is how they portrayed themselves in writing. I've always thought that the classic Jeb Stuart example in writing is his report from the 7 Days battles outside Richmond. Think for a moment what you all know about that episode. Robert E. Lee took command. He drove the Yankee Army away from Richmond in the last week of June 1862, cut their supply line east of town, and on June the 29th of 1862, Robert E. Lee sent Jeb Stuart and some horsemen over to the Pamunkey River to White House Landing, which had been the Yankee Army supply base. Lee wanted to know if the supply base had been abandoned. And so Stuart went galloping out there, and the Yankees were just leaving. Everything was on fire. The last Yankees had climbed on a little gunboat called the USS Marblehead, and Stuart was just too late to catch them. But that didn't stop him from trying. He deployed one little mountain howitzer under John Pelham and sent it flying down the banks of the river, trying to sink the USS Marblehead, like a little dog chasing a car. And Stuart described all of this in great drama in his official report for the public. And he couldn't just call the Marblehead a gunboat or a warship. He referred to it, quote, as, quote, this monster so terrible to our fancy. That's a classic Jeb Stuart passage, making a mountain out of a molehill. As Robert E. Lee said of Stuart, the general deals in the flowering style, which he did. And in preparing this talk a while ago, I tried to find the most comparable passage from Stonewall Jackson's own report of the 7 Days to read you for compare and contrast. I couldn't find one that was worth reading. It was so bland, so standard, so vanilla, nothing at all like a Jeb Stuart report. Victorian purple prose from Jeb Stuart, matter-of-factness from Stonewall Jackson. So Stuart embraced the frivolous and thrived on the simplest kind of mischief. In more recent times, he's the guy who would have enjoyed giving somebody a hot foot. I don't know if anybody does that anymore. If he was around when someone scotch taped a sign on the back of someone that said, pinch me or kick me, he would have thought that was hilarious. The more basic and broad the humor, the more uproarious and hilarious Jeb Stuart thought it was. So on a typical wartime morning then, Stonewall Jackson awoke and plotted how he could apply the principles of his Presbyterianism to performing his military duty. And Jeb Stuart woke up in a nearby tent and wondered how he could extract the most fun out of the day and still adhere to his military responsibilities. So those are many of the differences. There were some others, of course. But the similarities that drew the two men together are much more interesting, I think, and I'm going to go over three of them with you this afternoon. Number one, certainly a hyper-developed sense of duty. Remember that Jeb Stuart was a Robert E. Lee protege, and duty ruled Robert E. Lee's life. He would not have consorted with someone as closely as he did with Jeb Stuart, had Stuart not had a strong, well-developed sense of duty. Beneath all of the banjoism, Jeb Stuart was definitely a soldier and devoted to doing his duty as he defined it, as of course was Stonewall Jackson. Similar notions of duty was one of the common denominators between the two men. Stuart was more of a soldier than he let on. He was a tactical innovator. He helped redefine the role of cavalry in the United States. Not entirely by himself, but he was a key factor in that. And he was especially bold in developing horse artillery for use in campaigns, emphasizing speed over strength. That would be one of Jeb Stuart's legacies as a soldier. And like Robert E. Lee, both men, Stonewall Jackson and Jeb Stuart, were aggressive sometimes to the point of rashness. My own hierarchy of boldness, of audacity in the Army of Northern Virginia, I would put Robert E. Lee first, I'd put J.E.B. Stuart second, I'd put Stonewall Jackson third, and then I would put Jubal Early fourth. And then, of course, there were several other less senior men who didn't have as many opportunities to be aggressive, but that list would be pretty long. It'd be men like Isaac Trimble, for instance, or John B. Gordon, Robert Rhodes. All of those men were very aggressive, but it was a philosophy, it was a way of military life for Lee, Stuart, Jackson, and to some extent, Jubal Early. And Jackson and Stuart admired each other as soldiers. No question about it. Enough written correspondence exists to prove it. January of 1863, diary of a man on J.E.B. Stuart's staff. He wrote down that today J.E.B. Stuart said, not for the first time, quote, "Jackson is a man of military genius," with the military genius underscored. Stuart admired Jackson's ability. And their joint adventures on the battlefield and their successful reliance on each other is a sub-theme of this. Same views on duty executed in the same way. Number 2 on my list might surprise some of you, and that is religion. You think of Stonewall Jackson, you always think of religion. Dominated his life. You think of J.E.B. Stuart, you rarely think of religion. He was far more pious than he let on. It was hard to see through the smoke screen that he created for himself, the banjoism, the singing, the poetry, the dancing. Stuart, as a Christian, not well understood, but he invoked religion and expressed gratitude to divine influences in many of his reports. Once you got past the purple prose, there's an awful lot of thanking of God for helping us out. Anyone who doubts the honesty of that, if you think it was all just a facade, perhaps, for the press, you only need to look at Stuart's personal correspondence with his wife, which survives. In that private forum was just the same. He was less pious than Jackson, who wasn't, and he was definitely less demonstrative about it, but it was real. Walter Taylor, some of you know Walter Taylor, he was on Robert E. Lee's staff. He knew Stuart very well. He said, "Let it not be supposed that there was no sober nor serious side to the character of this gallant soldier. Behind and underlying all his freedom from care and lightheartedness, there was a vein of earnest conviction, a recognition of man's dependence upon his Maker, and an abounding faith in the promises of his Redeemer." That's J.E.B. Stuart he's writing about. One of J.E.B. Stuart's favorite phrases was "God's will be done." And on his deathbed, May the 12th of 1864, he lay dying at his brother-in-law's house in Richmond. His wife was on the way, didn't quite get there in time to see him before he expired, but his final request, while he could still talk, was for everyone who was around him, President Davis, a bunch of staff officers, to sing Rock of Ages, his favorite hymn. So he was thinking religiously at the very end. Now, I'm not suggesting that these two men read the Bible together. I very much doubt they fell to their knees and prayed together at any time in either man's tent. But it was much easier for them to get along because of the real religious beliefs of Stuart were compatible with the life beliefs of Stonewall Jackson. Could Stonewall Jackson ever have been a sincere, close friend of somebody like Jubal Early, for instance? The impious Jubal Early? Probably not. Number 3, I will not elaborate on it. It's a little more nuanced, but it's the old truth in human affairs, human relations, that sometimes opposites attract. And that's what happened in this case, often inexplicably. Now I want to give you a series of anecdotes, stories about their relationship. Some of them familiar, some of them less so, some of them published, some of them unpublished. And I'm going to do it chronologically. And the idea is that these are going to help to chart the progress of their blossoming friendship, while emphasizing some of the similarities and differences that I already went across. So their friendship, their partnership, probably began on May 10 of 1861. It's a foreboding day in Stonewall Jackson's biography because May 10, 1863, 2 years later, is the day he died from his Chancellorsville wounds. But on May 10th of 1861, Jackson was in the lower Shenandoah Valley around Harper's Ferry. And as far as I know, that's the first time these two men met. Stuart commanding a small force of cavalry, Jackson commanding a little bit of infantry, and together they were responsible for protecting the Potomac River and the northern end of the Shenandoah Valley around Martinsburg and Charlestown, Harper's Ferry, and Bunker Hill, and Falling Waters. And they were together for about 70 days. At that point, J.E.B. Stuart was 28 years old. Stonewall Jackson was 37 years old. So a little difference, but not a massive one. And Stuart spent most of that time screening Jackson's forces, was with him at Falling Waters. There was a little skirmish there on July 2nd of 1861, not a big affair, but they were in action together, at least sort of. And when Stonewall Jackson left for what became the first Manassas battlefield on July 18, he left the valley to go over to the Manassas battlefield. Stuart screened that movement and then followed with his own cavalry, and they were both present at First Manassas on the slopes of Henry Hill on July the 21st of 1861, the first big battle of the day. And we have here their first indirect interaction in a big battle, and this comes from William W. Blackford of J.E.B. Stuart's staff. He said after the war that Stuart, quote, was uneasy for fear that he would not be called into action. So every time a body of new troops appeared, Stuart sent me over to tell the commanding officer that he was there and to let him know when he, Stuart, could be of service with the cavalry. Well, Blackford made a bunch of those trips, and one time when he went over, the fresh troops were Stonewall Jackson's brigade, soon to be known as the Stonewall Brigade. And when he gave Stuart's message to Jackson, Jackson's face lit up with a smile, and he said, "That's good, that's good. Tell Stuart I will, that's good." According to Blackford, "that's good" was Stonewall Jackson's very favorite exclamation whenever anything pleased him. That's good. Well, Stuart eventually did make an attack that helped Jackson, but the call for help did not come from Jackson. Someone else ordered it. But the two of them fought on separate ends of Henry Hill successfully at First Manassas. What's interesting here, I think, is that soon thereafter, in the autumn of 1861, the two men separated for 9 months. This partnership, this friendship that I'm carrying on about, really only had that little period in 1861 and then the final 10 months when they were together. But the middle portion, they didn't even see each other. J.E.B. Stuart stayed with the big army in northern Virginia, became a protege of Joe Johnston. Jackson, of course, went into western Virginia, fought the Romney campaign, and messed around on the Potomac. And then, of course, that spilled into his famous Valley campaign, Kernstown in March of 1862, all the way through the conclusion at Cross Keys and Fort Republic in June of 1862. J.E.B. Stuart was nowhere in sight. The two men had no interaction at all from early autumn of 1861 until June of 1862. None. And yet the seeds that had been planted the previous year sprang quickly once the two were reunited during the 7 days battles outside Richmond. They first met again on June the 26th as Jackson had made a march by train and foot from the Shenandoah Valley to relieve, or not relieve, reinforce Robert E. Lee's army outside Richmond for the 7 days campaign. Lee's big offensive. J.E.B. Stuart was there to screen Jackson's movements as he came from Ashland toward Mechanicsville and the Chickahominy River, and the two of them met in the yard of a house that still stands today in a rural intersection in Hanover County. There's two historic houses right there at the crossroads where Jackson and Stuart met on the 26th. Stuart found Jackson, quote, all covered with dust, which is no surprise, and he was delighted to see General Stuart and rode out to one side of the road with him to have a consultation. The two men spent all of the next day together on June the 27th at the Battle of Gaines's Mill, the biggest of the 7 days battles. And what's interesting here, to me at least, is that it was not a field for cavalry. J.E.B. Stuart had nothing to do. There was no suitable ground for launching, I'm a little excited, no suitable ground for launching massive cavalry charges. There was no flank to go around. The terrain was too wooded, too swampy, too broken. There was nothing for Stuart to do but become a cheerleader, which he did. And he stood at Stonewall Jackson's side all during the afternoon under fire at the Battle of Gaines's Mill. At one point, Jackson, he felt sorry for Stuart. He said, General Stuart, is there an opportunity for cavalry here? And perhaps for the only time in his life, Stuart said no. as aggressive and audacious as he was unwilling to launch a charge against Cannon with his cavalry. The night after the battle, the night of the 27th, the two men spent the night together under the same blanket at the Cold Harbor crossroads, chattering like teenage girls at a slumber party about everything they had seen, witnessed, and experienced. And they slept that way for 2 or 3 hours and then got up and started figuring out how to chase the Yankees across the Chickahominy River. That night, Jackson said to Stuart, it was, quote, the most terrific fire of musketry I ever heard. The cannonading was much hotter than I liked. Stuart agreed with him, and they went on babbling about what they had seen. Stuart then left to go chase his monster, the USS Marblehead. Jackson stayed with the big army and went all the way down to Malvern Hill on July the 1st, participated in that battle. Stuart did not get back in time, but we have an anecdote from then, because Stuart wanted to get back in time, and he sent Blackford, his staff officer, on the night of July the 1st to tell Jackson he would be there the next morning, and also to report to Jackson that the Yankees had abandoned White House Landing, that McClellan was moving his base of operations from there down to the James River. And Blackford found Jackson on the Malvern Hill battlefield on the night of July the 1st, and according to Blackford, when Jackson heard Stuart's message, Jackson's response was, "That's good, that's good. Changing his base, is he? Ha ha." That's what the quote actually says. It says ha ha. Probably not something you picture with Stonewall Jackson in your mind's eye, him going ha ha, but I guess there's no other way to really write in letters a laugh. So just picture Jackson laughing at the notion of George McClellan changing his base. Association with J.E.B. Stuart, even indirectly, seemed to light some sort of a spark in Jackson's normally gruff manner. The two men worked together very closely in August of 1862 as the theater of operations changed to Northern Virginia, and in my opinion this was the perfect venue for them. The cooperation there played to each man's strengths. If you know much about the campaign in August on the way to the Potomac, both men were constantly raiding, riding, marching around Yankee flanks. It was perfect for both of them, from Cedar Mountain outside Culpeper to Gordonsville to the crossings of the Rappahannock River, and then all the way on up to the Potomac, of course. They thought alike, and they worked together intuitively during that part of the campaign. We have an anecdote from Cedar Mountain, Stonewall Jackson's battle on August the 9th of 1862. The next day there was a flag of truce for the burial of the dead between the lines, and a Georgia soldier happened to be standing next to Stuart and Jackson, who were together watching the flag of truce and the burial work. He said Jackson was quietly observing the ambulance corps during their duty, their sad duty, with that gay cavalier, General J.E.B. Stuart, by his side. Jackson was dressed in a faded gray suit, looking quite austere, as Stuart, with his accustomed hilarity, chatted merrily of the event that had so recently transpired. During the half hour I was near him, Jackson did not speak or smile. Stuart did all the talking, while Jackson's eagle eyes scanned the movements on the battlefield in our front. The following week, J.E.B. Stuart almost was captured outside Orange Courthouse, and the Yankees actually did get his plumed hat, which annoyed him greatly. That took place on August the 18th. He got his revenge the following week by raiding the Union supply line and capturing the dress uniform of John Pope, commander of the Union Army of Virginia. And Stuart laughed that up, his revenge. We have an account here from when he broke the news of capturing Pope's uniform to Stonewall Jackson. He rode into camp and supposedly yelled out, "Hello, Jackson, I've got Pope's coat. If you don't believe it, there's his name," holding up a magnificent new Major General's coat. Stuart apparently expected a loud laugh, but General Jackson said, "General Stuart, I would much rather you had brought General Pope instead of his coat." Always more practical than hilarious. Stonewall Jackson. Their best day of collaboration together during the entire war, certainly my opinion, probably everyone else's as well, was at the Battle of Sharpsburg on September 17, 1862, north of the Potomac. Once again, not a field suitable for cavalry. J.E.B. Stuart positioned himself on the northwest end of the Confederate line. Think what you know about the battlefield. I expect most of you have been there one time or another. Think of the landmarks. You know the Dunker Church. You know the West Woods. You know the Hagerstown Turnpike that runs right in front of the Dunker Church there? Well, west of the West Woods, behind the West Woods, is a towering ridge that is not part of the national park. You can't get up there as part of the normal tours. It's called Nicodemus Heights, and that is where Stonewall Jackson positioned his artillery. So they would be facing east, firing, very vaguely speaking, firing over Dunker Church toward the cornfield and into the flank of the Yankees who were attacking from north to south, Joe Hooker's corps of the Federal Army. And Jackson had his hands full trying to save his part of the army in the infantry fighting down in the West Woods and around the Dunker Church. You all know how bitter that was, how Confederates escaped with the skin of their teeth. And Jackson, probably on purpose, surrendered control of all of his artillery on Nicodemus Heights to J.E.B, who was not an artillerist. He just had nothing else to do, and he was somebody that Jackson already trusted. And so for the duration of the morning and into the early afternoon, J.E.B brought up artillery, he sent artillery away, he built lines of battle to protect the artillery, he rode around singing and waving his hat, all in the name of Stonewall Jackson, as a willing deputy to Stonewall at the Battle of Sharpsburg. One of the artillerists who was up there said that Stuart demonstrated on this occasion his ability to accomplish what it would seem impossible for one man to do. He commanded the line of skirmishers that kept up the perception of Confederate strength up there. And the stragglers were, quote, transformed from a lot of shirkers into a band of heroes. With his black plume floating, cheering and singing back and forth along the line, Stuart swept. He even knew enough to mix and match different kinds of cannon. Without getting too detailed for you, howitzers are shorter range, rifles are for longer range. He was able to gather the howitzers and fire them at close range when the Yankees got close, and then he was able to gather the rifled cannon, put them elsewhere, and fire at longer range toward the North Woods. He knew what he was doing, and he justified Stonewall Jackson's faith in him. Another artillerist who was up there said General Stuart was with or near the battery while we were in action, and General Jackson was with him for some time. And Jackson's matter-of-fact report on the battle said that Stuart's bold use of artillery secured for us an important position, which, had the enemy possessed it, might have commanded our left. This bold officer, meaning Stuart, rendered valuable service throughout the day. That's about the highest praise you would get from Stonewall Jackson. Pretty matter-of-fact, but accurate. Stuart was happy to serve as Stonewall Jackson's chief of artillery for a day, and it worked out perfectly. Soon thereafter, in that same month, Stuart gave Stonewall Jackson the famous gift, a brand new uniform coat. And there's been much written and said about that. It was a big surprise to Jackson. Not quite sure what prompted Stuart to do it. We have two accounts, two very differing accounts about this episode. We know Stuart did it. We know he sent the package with the new uniform coat over to Jackson, and his courier was Heros von Borcke, the gigantic Prussian staff officer who served Stuart. This is von Borcke's version. Said, I was heartily amused at the modest confusion with which the hero of many battles, meaning Jackson, the hero of many battles regarded the fine uniform from many points of view, scarcely daring to touch it, and in the quiet way which at last he folded it up carefully and deposited it in his portmanteau, saying to me, give Stuart my best thanks, Major. The coat is much too handsome for me, but I shall take care of it and shall prize it highly as a souvenir. That's not what Stuart wanted. So von Borcke, of course, said, no, you can't do that. Stuart wants you to try it on. And so Jackson wore it to dinner that evening with his staff, who were, quote, in a perfect ecstasy at their chief's brilliant appearance. The first wearing of a fresh robe by Louis XIV never created half the sensation at Versailles that was made in the woods of Virginia by the investment of Jackson in this new regulation uniform. The other account, a little less reliable but pretty entertaining, from the 1920s by a fellow who said he was there when von Borcke rode up. Von Borcke rode up, asked for Jackson, was directed to headquarters. Von Borcke then dismounted and took the box from the pommel of his saddle said, "General Jackson, this box contains a present from General Stuart." Jackson replied, "All right, Major, put it under the cot." They were striking tents, getting ready for battle. And this gentleman said, "But General Jackson, General Stuart told me to tell you to look into that box and see after the contents. Make sure they are satisfactory. I have to carry a reply to General Stuart." He was right out in the road waiting to go into action. The box contained a suit of clothes, and General Jackson put them on right there in the bushes. I never saw a man more gorgeously arrayed. Now, I'm not quite sure that's exactly what happened, but I like the image of Jackson changing clothes in the bushes beside a road to put on the fancy new uniform sent to him by his strange buddy. Von Borka then, according to his own account, asked Jackson to switch to a different horse because he looked too good to be riding on a little sword. There are casual correspondence between Jackson and Stuart. There's a lot of it that exists. It's unpublished. It's not very important. I'm going to read you just a couple of excerpts from it, just the notes they pass back and forth. What's important about them, not the contents, but the tone. July 25, 1862. Jackson to Stuart. "Much obliged to you for Napoleon's Maxims." That was another gift that Jeb Stuart had given Stonewall Jackson, a volume on Napoleon Bonaparte's Maxims of Warfare. Jackson to Stuart, September 30, 1862. "I am much obliged to you for the beautiful coat you have presented to me. When you come near, don't forget to call and see me. Signed, your much attached friend, T.J. Jackson." And then Jackson to Stuart, March 25, 1863. "I am much obliged for the magazine you sent me today. I was at your headquarters last week, but you were absent fighting Yankees as usual. I design visiting you soon, but don't let any of my designs interfere with you visiting me. Signed, very truly, your friend, T.J. Jackson." Doesn't really sound like Jackson's, a little different plane, a little different tone than what we're accustomed to. The two of them were becoming bosom buddies. October 1862, right after the Chambersburg raid, Jeb Stuart rode into Jackson's camp, and according to an eyewitness who was there, Jackson shouted out to him, "Howdy do, General Stuart. They tell me that from the time you crossed the Potomac into Maryland until you got back, you didn't sing a song or crack a single joke." That's what passes for hilarity from Stonewall Jackson. That's as close as he ever got to teasing anyone that I've ever seen, and it was with Jeb Stuart. And that brings us to the Moss Neck winter, the last winter of Stonewall Jackson's life. After the Battle of Fredericksburg, Jackson's headquarters was at a palatial mansion down the Rappahannock River from Fredericksburg called Moss Neck, Caroline County. Jackson took over the owner's office, his business office, an outbuilding out in the yard, and it was full of all sorts of things that a sportsman would have liked back then, horse racing things and hunting things and so forth. And that was Jackson's office for the winter of 1862 and 1863. According to Hunter McGuire, Jackson's physician, there was a great increase in Jackson's sociability, and he unbent much more. Major General Stuart especially used to break the ice and make Jackson laugh, sometimes uproariously, at his grotesque raillery, hence in part Jackson's fondness for Stuart. We have an account, unpublished, from one of Jackson's staff about the first time Jeb Stuart visited Jackson's office at Moss Neck. No sooner had he entered than he saw the pictures on the walls. He read aloud what was said about each noted racehorse and each splendid bull. At the hearth, he paused to scan with affected astonishment the horrid picture of a certain terrier that could kill so many rats a minute. He pretended to believe that they were General Jackson's own selections. And with great solemnity, he looked at the picture and then at General Jackson. He paused and stepped back, and in solemn tones said he wished to express his astonishment and grief at the display of General Jackson's low tastes. It would be a sad disappointment to the old ladies of the country who thought Jackson was a good man. General Jackson was delighted beyond measure. He blushed like a girl. And all the genial humor and frolic of that splendid cavalier, Jeb Stuart, were enjoyed exceedingly and with utter incapacity for response. Now, I know myself, across the course of my life, 3 or 4 people who are like that, who love to be teased or insulted the happiest they ever are, and yet they cannot respond. They just blush and enjoy it. And we may have a case of that with Stonewall Jackson. The more outrageous and ridiculous the teasing, the more he seemed to enjoy it, as long as it was coming from Jeb Stuart. And then the culmination, Christmas Day, December 25, 1862, Jackson convened a fabulous Christmas banquet at Moss Neck, and he invited Robert E. Lee and his staff, Jeb Stuart and his staff, William Nelson Pendleton and his staff, and then, of course, Jackson and his own staff. So 4 of the senior generals in the Army and probably 30 brilliant young staff officers. It was a famous dinner, and this is from a speech, by the way, by James Power Smith from Jackson's staff, delivered at a Robert E. Lee birthday event in 1898. How many thousands of times do you think over the years people have done what I'm doing, standing up on Lee's birthday or Jackson's birthday and trying to find something new to say on that event? Well, James Power Smith had better material than I do because he was there, and he reminisced about it. He said it was a famous dinner. Turkeys, oysters, hams, pickles, cakes, and a bottle of wine sent by Jackson's admirers, female admirers. Everyone teased Jackson. Robert E. Lee said that they were, quote, only playing soldiers, and invited us to dine with him and see how a real soldier ought to live. Jeb Stuart, meanwhile, was in great glee, ridiculing the white apron of the dining room attendant and playfully chiding General Jackson for his bottle of wine. In the center of the table was a pad of butter on which was a rooster. General Stuart declared that it was Jackson's coat of arms. And another staff officer who was there remembered Stuart, quote, bemoaning such an indication of Jackson's moral degeneracy. Pat of butter with a rooster on it. Perhaps Jackson was horribly fascinated by Jeb Stuart, like watching a train accident over and over and over. That brings us to the sad ending of this friendship between the two men. Of course, Jackson was mortally wounded May the 2nd outside Chancellorsville, and on the night of the 2nd. And immediately, Jeb Stuart was appointed temporary commander of Jackson's 2nd Corps, this famous cavalryman given command of 1/2 of Robert E. Lee's army in the most critical overnight period of its existence up to that point. Because on the night of the 2nd, when Jackson was wounded, Lee's army was already outnumbered 2-1 at Chancellorsville, and it was split in half. Lee commanding the half that was closest to Fredericksburg, Jackson and now Stuart commanding the half that was out toward Wilderness. The entire Yankee army was between the two of them, the disunited halves. That was the situation Jeb Stuart inherited, and he had no time to prepare for it. Jackson was wounded after dark. The battle began at dawn the next morning in that probably 9 to 10 hour window. They decided Stuart would have to take command. Stuart was notified. He had to figure out where his line was, where his half of the army was, make plans for the morning, and execute them. It's a terrible task. Jackson may have recommended Stuart to take over. It may have been Lee's decision. One source says it was A.P. Hill's decision, recommendation. So we may never get to the bottom of that. But it is pretty amazing that Stuart took over, and he succeeded. He did a good job for one day, commanding the Confederate infantry, his half of it, at the Battle of Chancellorsville. I have 2 accounts here from Henry Kidd Douglas, you know, of Stonewall Jackson's staff. These are unpublished letters written after the war. He said General Stuart's reputation in the Corps, this is Jackson's 2nd Corps, Stuart's reputation in the Corps then was, in some respects, only second to Jackson's. Jackson had great admiration for him as a soldier. Stuart was quick, daring, and able. Jackson knew that the men of his corps would have more confidence in Stuart than any man who could take his place. And in this case, he did right. I saw this, wrote Douglas, I saw this, although personally I never liked or admired Stuart, and still believe he was vain and pretentious and greatly overrated. And then in a follow-up letter, Kidd Douglas wrote this. He said, I think it was wise in the emergency to appoint Stuart. The effect on the troops was good, which Lee and Jackson and all of us knew. Stuart was a great imitator of Jackson's style with more dash and shove. I do not believe Jackson would have put Stuart in command over A.P. Hill if A.P. Hill had not already been wounded. although Jackson was a great admirer of Stuart. Stuart was well known in our Corps and well liked at headquarters. Certainly as a matter of policy, for its effect upon the troops, the selection was a most judicious one. Stuart managed the Corps well, and I remember telling General Jackson about it that night after the fight. Jackson's already on his deathbed, and he's getting reports about Jeb Stuart's handling of his troops at Chancellorsville. And then very famously, that morning before the battle, May the 3rd, right after Jackson was wounded, right after Stuart was appointed temporary commander, Stuart was able to send a staff officer to Jackson, minus his arm, and ask for advice. And very famously, Jackson said in response, "I don't know, I can't tell. Say to General Stuart that he must do what he thinks best." When Jackson died on May the 10th, of course, everybody went into mourning, especially Jeb Stuart. May the 12th, 48 hours later, Stuart heard, and someone wrote it down in the diary, Stuart heard that Jackson on his deathbed had expressed a desire that he, Stuart, should permanently succeed him in command of the Second Corps. And Stuart said that day on May the 12th, "I would rather know that Jackson said that than to actually have the appointment." As summed up by Henry Kidd Douglas, the intimacy between these two officers, so dissimilar in every respect, was the cause of much comment. Jackson was more free and familiar with Stuart than with any other officer in the Army, and Stuart loved Jackson more than he did any living man. I live just north of Richmond, right on the edge of pathetic remnants of the Yellow Tavern battlefield, where Jeb Stuart was mortally wounded in May of 1864. And there's a monument there where Stuart was wounded, where he was fatally shot. It's the only one that still stands, escaped the purge from the clowns in Richmond, because the United Daughters of the Confederacy own it. It's not owned by the city, it's not owned by the county, it's not owned by somebody who can destroy it. It's owned by the Daughters of the Confederacy. And they have only about a quarter of an acre there, right where Stuart was mortally wounded, and they have an annual small program there on May 11th every year. And I always go over, not for the program, but I go over that evening and pay my respects with a bunch of my friends at the site. And I still remember, it's a story I've told many times over the years, I still remember from 20 years ago, one evening when I went over there on the anniversary, and there was a handwritten sign propped up against the monument, a magic marker on cardboard, kind of like you'd see for a yard sale advertisement in your neighborhood, said, "We love you, Jeb." Don't know who put it there, don't know how long it lasted, probably not very long. Stuart, the point of this is Stuart still carries the fervid allegiance of many, many people. And so, of course, to Stonewall Jackson. Countless thousands of enthusiasts have been specially drawn to these two men, one or the other, over the passing years, often because of the singular styles of the two men, as much as for their achievements. But very rarely is an enthusiast equally excited about both. It's one or the other. You're either a Stuart guy or you're a Jackson guy, but not both. And yet the amazing thing, as we've seen here this afternoon, is that those two generals, the real items, the men themselves, were oddly drawn to each other. And here we are 160 years later, and we're still talking about it. For Jackson and Stuart, their obvious differences were no obstacle at all. Instead, they constructed a fruitful military partnership that had as its keystone a sincere personal friendship, one that must rank as among the most intriguing, if not the most intriguing, in the whole history of the Army of Northern Virginia. Thank you for listening to me today. I'm instructed to take a couple of questions if there are some. I see one in the front row. Yes, sir.
Do you have any comments on your anecdote of Jackson and Stuart's slumber party? The way I heard it, the next morning when they awoke, Jackson said, "General Stuart, next time we share a cot." I'd appreciate you taking your spurs.
Normally I repeat questions. I'm just going to repeat that one particularly, but it was a comment about the Jackson-Stuart slumber party. at Old Cold Harbor Crossroads on the night of June the 27th after the Battle of Gaines's Mill. In that much more innocent age, nobody thought twice about it, of course. The two men shared a blanket and didn't worry about it. The part of the story that I didn't tell you was that Stuart was already there when Jackson rode up looking for a place to sleep that night. And Stuart asked Jackson, he said, General Jackson, where's all of your staff? And he said, they're off on different errands. I'm playing staff officer myself tonight. And lay down and started talking about the battle for a while. I don't think they slept very long. Whether they had their spurs on or not, I don't know. But I use the anecdote because it shows a familiar friendship, not an unusual friendship, but it shows the familiarity that they had 2 days before. June the 26th was the first time they'd seen each other, as far as I know, in 7 or 8, maybe 9 months. So they just kind of got right back into their old acquaintanceship from 1861. It's nothing more than that. Any others? There are none. All right. Thank you.
That was an excellent talk. Appreciate that. At this point, we will have